Okay, so in this video, we'll create a value chart using the grid that you saw in the PowerPoint presentation. I have black, I have white, standard palette knife, a flat brush, long bristles with a flat profile at the top, and I have a jar with wire mesh on the inside that I recommend. This one is from Michaels. It's a brush washer, and there's also one very similar to this called Silicoil that you can purchase at Blix. I have paper towels to clean off the brushes. In between each value that we mix, we want to make sure we clean our brush off. And to begin, you follow the instructions on the PowerPoint presentation. Create a 5-inch wide by 9-inch high grid or chart. Divide it down the middle by a 1-inch strip, 1 inch wide. And on either side of that strip, to the left and to the right, we have 1-inch rows, 1 by 2, 1 inch high by 2 inches wide on either side. That should equal 9 rows, and we number them 1 through 9. What we're creating here is a value scale, or a grayscale, and value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a color. We'll be using gray, and this exercise serves several purposes. For one, we'll explore the idea of value by creating the value scale. Color mixing, we'll mix the different values using our palette knife, and paint application, which we'll get into little by little until we get into color and start working on our final painting. The other thing that I want to address in this particular exercise is something called simultaneous contrast, and that refers to the relativity of color or value, color and value, we should say, and how color and value affect one another. That's why we have the strip going down the middle. To begin, we're going to mix a middle gray, equal amounts of white and black to get a middle gray. That's going to be our number 5, section number 5, plus the vertical strip. So these two sections, this row number 5, and the vertical strip are going to be the same middle gray. And what happens is, as we mix darker values and lighter values, that middle gray is going to look slightly different. The perception of that middle gray is going to change. When that middle gray is next to a light gray, it's going to look a little darker. And as we move our way down, the middle gray is going to be juxtaposed with the darker grays. It's going to look a little bit lighter, and you'll be able to perceive that shift. It's fascinating. But that's something that's really key in terms of working with value, and also when we get into color, because colors have values, their own values as well. So let's begin by mixing our middle gray. Equal amounts of white mixed with black. And everyone's going to approach this a little bit differently. You might do the light values first, or you might choose to do the dark values first. You might go back and forth between them. It really doesn't matter as long as the end result is the same. So what I'm doing here is just squeezing out roughly an equal amount of paint, black and white, and just estimating. But there are different ways that you can do this. Some folks are more precise than others. You might take a teaspoon and squeeze paint out onto the teaspoon and then scrape off the excess so you know you have an equal amount. But that's a lot of paint that ends up being wasted. I use a line, and I try to squeeze it using an equal amount of pressure to get a line of paint. And then from there on, basically, to be honest with you, I kind of guesstimate and try to shoot for a 50-50 mix. So once you have the paint squeezed out, take your palette knife. These palette knives are nice because they're offset, so you don't scrape your knuckles on the palette. The handle is raised a bit. And when mixing, I use different techniques, circular techniques with the point of the knife, and I begin to mix using the side of the knife until you have an even gray, an even color, uniform. And from there, take my brush and begin filling in. This is oil paint. I'm not adding any medium to the paint. I can begin with the middle strip because I know that's going to be a middle gray, and work my way down from there. And using the front edge of the flat brush, I push the paint up to the line. So this is the middle gray, that's row number 5, and the vertical strip down the center. It's okay to use oil paint without linseed oil. You don't really have to thin it out all the time, and that way it's a little less messy. But the linseed oil, when you do need to use it, it helps the flow. It does improve flow and working time. And here we'll skip the linseed oil and just use the paint right out of the tube. Now I know from experience that some folks will really take to this. They might really enjoy doing these charts, and they're very meticulous, and then other folks not so not so much, but that's okay. I think in the end, as long as we get the idea, and as long as the values are mixed evenly across the chart, we'll be okay. Try to keep your hands off the wet paint. That's probably the hardest thing about this. Alright, so we have that middle gray filled in. Now my brush is full of paint, the palette knife, you want to clean that off. So when you mix the next value, that value is not tainted too much by the paint on the brush. Okay, so I'm going to shoot for number 4, and for that value, I'm going to take some of my middle gray, and add an equal amount of white to that. Roughly. And begin mixing. I'm not going to go through the whole chart in this video. I'll do a couple of values, a couple of rows, and then we'll come back to it. I'll show you the finished product, and then you'll have an idea of what we're doing. Okay, so that looks pretty uniform. Just a tip, if you don't want to get paint on your hands while you're working, you have a couple of options. They make something called the barrier cream, which you can find at the local art supply store. And you just put that on your hands prior to painting, and it creates a kind of a barrier, as the name implies. And you can also buy vinyl gloves or latex gloves. Okay. Number 4, to the left and to the right of the center line or strip. Now we have our row number 4 filled in. And what we've done by adding white to that middle gray, when you add white to a color, that's considered a tint. And we'll work more with that later. When you add black to a color, which I'm going to do right now, that's considered a shade. So as we work our way up, you have a lighter value. We have our middle gray. We took a little bit of that middle gray and added an equal amount of white to that to get row number 4, to get a lighter tint. And now in order to get row number 3, I would do the same. I would take that middle, not the middle gray, sorry, but gray number 4, let's say, take that gray, maybe leave a little bit for touch-ups, and add an equal amount of white to that to get row number 3. And you do the same as you move your way up in the value scale. Now what I'm going to do is take black. Take my black and the middle gray, add an equal amount of black to that, roughly. And mix it. And you should see a difference with each succeeding value. You should be able to see the difference. If they look like they're too close, or if it's too big of a jump, then there's something wrong in the mix. It should look even in terms of the gradation, and you should be able to see the difference from one value to the other. Okay, this is a shade. I added an equal amount of black to our middle gray, and I'm going to fill in row number 6. And you can see the difference already. And my brush has a little bit of paint thinner on there. I use Gamsol, made by Gamblin. That's highly refined thinner. Let's see if I can get rid of some of that excess thinner on the brush. We want the paint to be fairly opaque, if not completely opaque. If any of the white of the canvas pad shows through, and basically that white is going to lighten. It's going to serve like adding, as if you were adding white to the paint. It's going to lighten the value a little bit as it peeks through. So we want to avoid that by making sure that our paint is opaque to block out the white canvas pad. Okay, so our middle gray and our first 2 values, lighter value, a tint, and a darker value, a shade. And I'll keep working on this and report back to you a little bit later to show you the finished product. Okay, our value scale is complete. It's okay if it gets a little messy around the edges, but let's try to keep the value scale, the chart itself, as neat as possible. I ended up using two brushes, the flat for the dark values and a filbert, which has a tapered profile for the lighter values. It made clean up a little bit easier, so that's a good tip. And that's it.